early phases, I was interested. I've had this sort of intuition, or the logos told me that every cycle should begin with a bang, literally, and that this bang was the trickle-down resonance of the Big Bang. And I gained support for this idea from, although to call this a source of support, from Finnegan's Wake, where, there are instances of what is called Viconian thunder, these huge thunderous words that begin every new section of the wake. So I thought that I should look at Big Bangs, and when I looked at the 20th century and was trying to figure out where to start the cycle of the presumably last, but in any case, 67-year, 104.25 day cycle, where to start it in the 20th century, the Big Bang that I settled on was Hiroshima, August the 5th, 1945. And if you add 67 years, 104.25 days to that, you come very, very close to this December 22nd, 2012 date, plus everything else seemed to fit. And then what, for me, made it more persuasive was that after this was all completed and pretty much set in concrete in my mind, someone pointed out to me that the Mayan calendar ends on that precise date, that day. And this is you can call it a peculiar coincidence, but this whole realm is fraught with coincidence. The list was simply sort of what you know if you have a good liberal education. In other words, you know the Golden Age of Greece, the Italian Renaissance, the European Enlightenment, and the 20th century. And then you begin looking at the fine detail based on that. When I first began, I thought that the discovery of relativity was it. But that would have made the grand finale occur in 1973. Let me tell you a story, just so you can see how peculiar this is. Yes, so I fastened in on the theory of relativity, and I calculated forward that to try and find the end date. And it ended on the winter solstice of 1973. And I thought that was moderately interesting. It was when you propagated it forward 2 of these 384-day things. So then I went to the astronomical library at Cal and looked up in the ephemeris of eclipses, and I discovered that on this winter solstice of 1973, there would be a total eclipse of the sun. And I thought that was interesting. These accumulated, that's what you look for, is accumulations of density of coincidence. And they publish in these astronomical atlases all the eclipses of the next 1,000 years and the past 1,000 years, and they publish maps of the tracks of all of these eclipses. So I looked up the track of the eclipse of December 22nd, 1973, and it started, I think, out in the Pacific Ocean somewhere. At totality, it swept across La Chorrera, and it completed itself in the delta of the Amazon over the city of Belém, which is a big river city in the Amazon. Well, I looked at this, and as an amateur scholar of Joyce, I was aware that the delta symbol for Joyce was always the vagina. There's that whole geometry lesson in Finnegan's Wake that has to do with the inverting of the triangles, which is actually this obscene thing that he's going through. So I knew that the delta was the symbol of the vagina, and then I saw that this eclipse ended in the delta of the Amazon. And then I thought, of course, the delta of the Amazon, the world mother. The Amazon is, the largest female geographical feature on the planet. And here we had a total eclipse of the sun on a winter solstice, completing itself at Belém. And Belém is the Portuguese word for Bethlehem. You see, I was seriously, it's called delusion of reference, this condition. So, and I thought, wow, far out. Now we have the answer to Yeats' question. Do you know what Yeats' question was? What rough beast is it that slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? And so I was all quite keen on all of this. Now, as if that weren't strange enough, whenever somebody comes up with something like that, the desperate argument of the pseudo-rationalists, when really slammed to the wall, is that this information was known, it was published in books, these eclipse tracks, these ephemerides, and so forth. It was all published in books, and consequently, you didn't predict the future. You merely tapped into the sum total of the human database already existent, and your unconscious has taken all these clues and all this data and woven it together into a delusion which is designed to suck you in and trap you. Well, this is a hard argument to overcome. The only way that you could overcome that argument is that if you predicted an event that was non-repeating and that nobody on Earth knew it was going to happen or could possibly know that it's going to happen at the time you make the prediction. So I was in the early months of 73 and the late months of 72 running around telling everybody that this winter solstice with an eclipse over the delta of the Amazon was going to be of cosmic importance. Well then, about March of 1973, I was reading my morning paper, and on page 4 there was this large headline, and it said, brightest comet yet headed toward Earth. And I was reading this thing, and it said, this object will reach perihelion, meaning closest approach to the sun, on December 22nd of this year. This was the comet Kohoutek. Well, now the interesting thing about Kohoutek was it didn't amount to much, but I had predicted its window of appearance before it was detected by human beings or instruments anywhere on the planet. So it was, just from the mushroom to me, like a perfect proof that it was giving information that couldn't come from the human unconscious, couldn't come from any calculation of past events, that a unique long-period comet, never before seen, and probably never to be seen again, was going to fall right smack in the center of my window of predictive intensity. So, it's just an instance of the cosmic giggle. I mean, in terms of what does it mean? It's like, when that question was posed to Mr. Natural, he said, it don't mean shit. But isn't it strange? Well, morphogenetic fields, the theory that lies behind the I Ching, all of these things are attempts to make a statement about the frontier of understanding. And to the degree that, in other words, it's like there's a perception which wants to be born, but it is, since it's at the edge of cognitive revelation, it's very hard to get it right. I mean, the I Ching, morphogenetic fields, the Tarot, the time wave that we looked at yesterday, these are all attempts to encompass within a metaphor something which is at present almost unsayable. It's very interesting, if you care about this kind of thing, to go back into the history of the evolution of ideas and see what it is like, what the ideological climate is like right before an idea crystallizes and is finally gotten straight, or pretty straight. An area where that happened that I spent some time poking around in is the 15 years preceding Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species and Alfred Russel Wallace's paper to the Royal Society in London. All of biology in England and Germany and on the continent, all of biology was intensely involved with what the literature of the time called the problem of the species. And, all these people were exploring various parts of the world, especially the tropics. They could see that if you go from one Indonesian island to another, there is shift of species. There are slightly modified forms. In other words, they had all the ingredients in front of them on the table, and people were trying to figure it out, but they didn't quite have it. And then it crystallized in the minds of certain people. For Alfred Russel Wallace, who is the real discoverer of natural selection, it sort of relates to our theory of creativity. He had malaria on the island of Ternate, north of the Moluccas, or in the North Moluccas. And in the 5th day of this intense malarial fever, he saw the solution to the problem of the species. And he wrote it down in this fevered state, and then he worked his way through this illness. And when he came down and looked at what he'd written, he couldn't find fault with it. It seemed right. It's just a page and a half. It's preserved. It's all there. So he didn't know what exactly to do. So he decided he would write a letter to the greatest natural scientist of the age, who was the aristocratic and well-connected Charles Darwin back in England. By this time, Wallace had been 6 years knocking around in the forests of Indonesia. So he sends this letter to Darwin. Darwin had been working on The Origin of Species for nearly 18 years. This letter arrives in the post. He opens it up, and he just says, "Oh, shit. Who is this guy? Some surveyor from Wales has beaten me to the punch, And so he I don't suppose he got on the phone, but he sent a message with a servant to Charles Lyell, who was his great friend and the chair and the president of the Royal Society at that time, and said, Charlie, this is a real problem. I'm bringing this book out. This guy, some clown, this guy looks like he scooped me. And Lyell said, don't worry, here's what we'll do. We'll get him to deliver a paper at the Royal Society, and we'll have you deliver a paper the same evening. And you know how everybody adjourns to get drunk at the intermission, so we'll just schedule him after the intermission. And this was done. And this is why Charles Darwin is the discoverer of evolution. For a few decades, it was called the Darwin-Wallace theory, but eventually, it's an interesting story, although not relevant to what we're doing, but what overturned, well, somewhat relevant, the reason Wallace became persona non grata in English science was because he would not genuflect before pure reductionism. He said there is more to evolution than mutation and natural selection. There is a spiritual element, and that was all it took for him to get the boot, because 19th century scientific theory in biology was absolutely phobic of deism, belief in God. They were really far more committed atheists than I would wager most of us are. It was a point of pride with them to squeeze spiritual assumptions out of all of their theories. There is no purpose recognized in Darwinian evolutionary theory. To speak of purpose in their minds was to completely misunderstand what was being suggested, and what they wanted was a theory of how life could evolve and come to be that would be specifically without purpose, because the only kind of purpose they could imagine was God's plan, and they wanted to dump that whole idea. It was a very fierce intellectual struggle. As the inheritors of the victory, we don't really realize what a desperate struggle that was. I mean, as recently as 120 years ago, you could call yourself a member of the British intelligentsia, and you could believe that the Earth was created at 10 a.m. on September the 6th, 2344 BC. That was educated Christian opinion in England as recently as 120 years ago. So we have made considerable intellectual progress, at least. They calculated, they read the Bible, all those begats, you know, and the ages of each person. So-and-so lived to be 120 years, and he begat so-and-so, and they added it all up, and that was the date.
Misplacement of their own time weight.
Well, yeah. They had an incredibly limited view of the possibility of cosmic time. This is an intellectual revolution that has taken place almost within our lifetimes. People had no idea how old the world was and how old human beings were. I mean, that was as far as the imagination of Western Europe could be stretched, to the idea that the Earth was 4,500 years old. You know, at the turn of the century, when these French peasants were out digging truffles or feeding their goats or something, and they fell into the hole that led to the Lascaux paintings, and they saw all these, you know, the bison and the deer and these amazing paintings, said, you know, this is really important. Let's tell the experts in Paris. So the great experts on the art of Europe came and down and lowered themselves into this cave and viewed all this stuff, and then announced to the Paris newspapers that this stuff was not old, that in their expert opinion, these things had probably been done as a kind of amusement by French soldiers in the Grand Army of Napoleon who overwintered there in 1812, you know. So they were saying it's basically less than 100 years old from their vantage point. These things were 20 to 25,000 years old. And as this dawned, this realization, this is the discovery of deep time. The idea that the Earth could be 4 billion years old, you know. These were astonishing intellectual revolutions of which we're the inheritors, and we've sort of grown up with these assumptions. But they are very, very recent leaps in the evolution of the European imagination.
The United States
That's right. Oh, yeah. We're a country of rattlesnake handling screwballs. I mean, every time I go to Europe, it amazes me the great difference between Europe and the United States is that it's a secular society over there. You know, they have transcended fundamentalism pretty thoroughly, and so discussions about social mores or drugs or stuff like that can go on without invoking concepts like God's wrath and Jesus' plan and stuff where you just, oy vey. Originally, astrology was to chart basically the course of reigns of kings, and kings were assumed to be macrocosms of society. So really, astrology was created to chart the destiny of nations and peoples. In the Renaissance, with the birth of the idea of the individual, really, people for the first time began to think of, well, what about my horoscope, you know? And really, I think the evolution of the personal horoscope, although I'm sure astrologers will rise in a single body to shout this down, but the rise of the individual horoscope is essentially a capitalist phenomenon where you then create a product that can be dealt. Because if you're only casting horoscopes for the court, pretty soon there aren't too many horoscopes needing to be cast. The way you do it with the time wave, if you want to get your individual wave, is the way I think of the big wave that we looked at yesterday is that it is, in a sense, the average of all the little waves. That we each are a little wave, and when you average them all together, you get the big wave. Sort of the way, if you have enough atoms of gold and you put them together, pretty soon you have an ingot of gold. And the ingot of gold has a different architecture than gold atoms, but it's made of gold atoms. Anyway, the way you do that for an individual is you take your birth date and you add 67 years, 104.25 days. That's one cycle. You add that to your birth date, and you enter that as the end date rather than December 22nd, 2012. You add that, you use that as the end date, and then you look back at your life. Now, what this implies is that at age 67 years, 104.25 days, you have an excellent opportunity to die. If you miss this opportunity, there won't be such a good opportunity as that for 67 more years. So you sort of have to, I don't know. I don't take this stuff seriously, and neither should you. Well, in a way, what this is just showing you the architecture of the hologram. You know how one of the interesting features of a hologram is when you cut a little piece out of it, you have the whole thing. You can cut a square out of the middle of a hologram, and when you illuminate that little square, the whole thing is still there. This is the magic of the hologram, that all of the information is distributed through each point on the hologram. And you can take that little square and cut a little square out of it and illuminate it, and the whole hologram will be there. Now, what you're losing in this is resolution. The detail gets dimmer and dimmer, but the major outlines remain. This is a quality of fractals. You see, information in a hologram is distributed according to what mathematicians call a Fourier transform. And when you analyze Fourier transforms, they turn out to be a kind of fractal. So these resonances that I was showing you yesterday, where we see how the Third Reich relates to ancient Egypt and stuff like that, well, that's a one-day course in the time wave version of how these resonances work. Really, there are dozens of major resonances and thousands of minor resonances that go in to making up a given moment. So if we were to analyze this moment in high detail, we would build trees of resonances of less and less input but still present that would show us the situation in great complexity, because many, many times are present, all time. Ultimately, if you draw the resonance trees out far enough, you discover all time is present in every moment. Eternity in a grain of sand. Wasn't that William Blake's rap? That's the bottom line of all of these theories, is that the whole history of the universe is contained, recapitulated, and somehow present in every moment, or every year, or every millennium, or every million years. It's a series of hologramized, refractive, fractalized self-referentiality.